There are moments in life when a single passing breeze is enough to change someone's entire destiny. Out in the wide, endless stretches of the American West, a man who had once lost everything posted a simple midday notice looking for a cook never, imagining that the person who would knock on his ranch door was a poor widow, carrying 2 children in her arms, bringing with her a past heavy as stone and a hope fragile as thread. But what if one day your past came back to you, stood at your doorstep, and demanded that you pay for things you no longer wish to remember? What would you do? Would you run, or would you stay and protect the people who have just stepped into your life? If you were in that moment, growing older, carrying an old wounded heart, would you still have the courage to open the door for love one more time? I invite you to step into this story where silence sometimes speaks louder than love itself, and where hearts that once seemed out of breath find their rhythm again. And if this story stirs something inside you, please like, share, and subscribe so you can walk with us through all the journeys still ahead. Morning in Thorn Valley always began with the silver wash of light, thin as mist, settling across the long stretches of grass and making the whole valley look both vast and heartbreakingly lonely. On the southern rim of that valley, Morgan Ranch lay quiet beneath a deep, unbroken sky. The porch roof was layered with wood dust. A rope hung by the horse shed, swaying lightly in the breeze. Everything here carried the breath of time and the unmistakable absence of human presence. Caleb Morgan stood on the front porch, both hands braced against the weathered wooden railing. He was in his 50s, built in that sturdy western way, quiet, solid, like an old cypress whose roots had sunk deep into this land. A dark brown canvas coat rested on his shoulders, its sleeves worn at the edges. The wide-brimmed hat, shading half his face, did little to hide the look in his eyes toughened by grief and by years lived in silence. His breath drifted into the cold morning air. Caleb was used to this cold, the same way he'd grown used to living without the sound of a woman's voice in the house, without small footsteps running across the living room, without the bright laughter that once filled his kitchen. 5 years earlier, his wife, Eleanor, had died during a pneumonia outbreak that swept the region. Her death drained every hint of color from Morgan Ranch. Since then, Caleb's world had shrunk into a routine of repairs and chores, checking the fences, tending the horses, chopping wood, patching the barn roof, and enduring the silence that hung over everything like a slow, dull ache. Silence has a strange kind of power. It isn't loud, and it isn't violent. It's like cold water, steady and persistent, working its way into every crack within a person's heart, whether he admitted it or not. Caleb always felt it tugging him quietly away from the world. That morning, standing on the porch, he found himself wondering, what do I have left here besides empty walls? He never said the question aloud, but it lived somewhere within his cold gray gaze, the gaze of a man who had witnessed more loss than he ever cared to remember. Near noon, Caleb saddled his chestnut stallion and prepared to ride into Hawthorne Ridge. He needed to post a notice for a new cook, not because he wanted company. He simply needed someone to manage the kitchen, to keep his meals decent, to help him stop losing weight. For years he'd survived on burnt coffee, salted meat, and bread so hard a child could have used it as a weapon. Even Sheriff Whitaker once shook his head and said, "Caleb, a man living like this is bound to wear out. Even rock-hard folks need a little warmth." Caleb had only shrugged. He didn't need warmth. At least that's what he told himself. Hawthorne Ridge, just 3 miles from the ranch, was a small but lively town where families had known each other for generations. When Caleb rode down the main street, he received a few nods from the hunchbacked blacksmith, from Mrs. Porter at the general store, from a couple of men hauling whiskey crates into the old saloon. At the post office, Caleb pulled a sheet of paper from his coat pocket, something he had written carefully the night before, looking for a cook for Morgan Ranch, full-time position, room and board included, report at 12 noon on Thursday. Just a few lines, clean, precise, nothing more, nothing less. He wasn't opening the door to attachment, something he had avoided for years. Mrs. Helene Porter saw him posting the notice and sighed beside him. A big ranch like yours and only one man living in it. No one can stay alone forever. Caleb, maybe what you need isn't just a cook. His reply was low, and even lonely folks live the easiest. Mrs. Porter, she shook her head. Or maybe they're just scared of being hurt again. Caleb said nothing, and in that silence sat a great many things he chose not to reveal. Mrs. Porter didn't press further. At Caleb's age, people often carried wounds that didn't need to be displayed to anyone. On the way back to Morgan Ranch, the cold wind whipped against his coat. The western sky had turned gray, a sign that stronger winds were coming. His stallion snorted, unsettled by the gusts tugging at its mane. Caleb stopped atop a small rise overlooking his ranch, the big house with its old porch, the long line of barns stretching behind it, the rough wooden fencing arching around it. It all looked like a scene from an old western painting, solitary, wild, full of dust and wind. But it was also the place that had held his entire life. His chest tightened when his eyes drifted to the window where Eleanor had once hung strips of fabric she had sewn herself. Now the window was coated in dust, the curtain torn and fluttering in the breeze. He exhaled slowly, tightened his grip on the reins, then nudged the horse forward. Caleb had no way of knowing that the paper he posted earlier that day was about to open a completely new chapter in his life. It wouldn't just bring him a cook. It would bring him something he hadn't dared to imagine in years, a family, a chance to live again. But, for now, he remained the aging man residing in the shadowed quiet of a vast home. And that silence was waiting for someone to come and break it. That noon. The sunlight hung over Thorn Valley like a gold coin someone had accidentally left on nature's tablecloth. Light poured across every porch roof, every tree trunk, every patch of dry grass. The sun seemed to sharpen the silvery gray tone of Morgan Ranch, making the stillness in the air feel even more pronounced. On the wooden desk in his study, the paper Caleb Morgan had written the night before lay neatly in place. He looked at it one more time. The handwriting was straight, firm, without a single exclamation mark or inviting flourish. Just what needed to be said. Nothing extra, nothing warm. Precise like the man he had been for years. Full-time cook needed. Room and board at the ranch. Report at 12 noon on Thursday. He folded the paper carefully, slipped it into his coat pocket, and headed out the door. His boots thudded against the wooden floor each step, echoing hollowly, like someone knocking on a room left empty for far too long. His chestnut horse stood by the stable, stirring up dust with its front hoof. Caleb gave the animal a quiet pat on the neck. Through all these years, it was the only living creature that ever heard him talk, though it never replied. He tightened the reins, set his foot in the stirrup, swung into the saddle, and rode out of the ranch. The road to Hawthorne Ridge cut through a tall line of pines, where the wind hissed through the branches like the voices of those who traveled this land generations before him. The farther he rode, the deeper he drifted into a vague internal void. Posting a job notice wasn't a big deal, but the real weight pressing on him was the thought of letting a stranger step into a space that had been frozen in silence for so many years. Caleb reminded himself, I'm not looking for companionship. I'm not looking for warmth. I only need someone who knows how to handle pots and pans, someone to keep the kitchen from going cold. But the idea of another human presence at the ranch made him tighten the reins just slightly. Something surfaced, something he wasn't ready to name. When he finally reached the town, Hawthorne Ridge was humming with its usual small western bustle, people calling to one another, wagon wheels grinding over dirt, the constant creak of the general store door. A few old men smoked on the saloon steps. Children ran shouting through the narrow gap between the post office and the blacksmith shop. Life here continued as it always had, lively in the way of small towns where everyone knew everyone else's business, but still respected the pain others chose not to speak of. Caleb stopped his horse in front of the post office, dismounted, and tied the reins to a wooden post. The doorbell chimed softly as he stepped inside, and a cooler air drifted out to meet him. The place smelled of paper, ink, and old wood, its own familiar blend. The bulletin board sat near the window, just a plain slab of wood packed with notes from people hiring help or looking to buy something. Caleb pinned his notice to a fitting, empty spot. He stood there a few seconds, staring at the words he had written with such deliberate restraint. Moments later, Mrs. Helene Porter walked in carrying a basket. Her glance slid over the new notice, then shifted to him. She was a few years older than Caleb, with a kind face and a seasoned softness that suggested she understood more than she ever said. She spoke with a mix of gentleness and concern. "Caleb Morgan hiring a cook. So you're finally letting someone help you." Caleb nodded lightly. "Just need someone to keep the kitchen going. The ranch won't wait for me forever. Mrs." Porter looked straight into his eyes, one of those looks that made a person feel she could see right through them. People need food, Caleb, but sometimes people need something far more than that. The silence at Morgan Ranch is louder than a winter storm. Have you ever noticed that he didn't answer? His eyes drifted to the dusty boots on his feet. Mrs. Porter didn't push him. She simply laid a gentle hand on his coat sleeve and offered a warm, patient smile. "I hope whoever comes because of that notice is someone you won't chase off the moment they arrive." Her words followed him all the way home, like a small stone tucked into his pocket. Growing heavier with every step, he didn't think she was wrong. But to allow another person into a life already cracked and fragile felt like standing at the edge of a fog-covered road where every step might awaken old wounds. By the time he reached the ranch, the sunlight had softened into a quiet orange, pouring honey over the fence lines and barn roofs. Caleb tied up his horse, walked onto the porch, and leaned against a wooden pillar. He looked around the tall wild shrubs, the swaying patches of grass, the yard so empty that even a sigh would echo clearly. He muttered to himself, under his breath, "Hopefully nothing changes. I don't need any trouble." But then, as he turned to go inside, a faint flicker lit up in him, so small he almost missed it. Something like anticipation. Even if he wouldn't admit it, it threaded its way in quietly, like a trickle of water seeping through stone. Not loud, just patient. And that tiny spark made his steps slow as he crossed the living room. The familiar gloom of the walls greeted him once again. He wondered if, somewhere among all the empty spaces of this house, there was still room left for a new breath of life. Caleb knew Thursday would come quickly. He wasn't expecting anything. He was merely bracing himself for whoever might show up at exactly noon. But deep inside, a very small part of him was no longer silent. He didn't know why, and he didn't want to think too hard about it. Thorn Valley remained peaceful that day, just like any other. No one in town had any idea that the simple sheet of paper pinned to the post office wall would open a story they'd talk about for years to come. And Caleb Morgan himself had no idea that his life was about to change in ways he never could have imagined. East of Hawthorne Ridge, a little over 2.5 miles from Morgan Ranch, stood a small house tucked beneath 2 old cottonwood trees. From the outside, it looked no different from any other home in the region than faded wooden roof, dust-covered walls, worn-out windows. But to the Dawson family, that house was their entire world. even though that world had grown too cramped, too fragile, and too difficult to hold on to. That noon, Miriam Dawson sat at the small kitchen table. On it lay the notice she had brought home from town. The crease on the corner of the paper showed she had held it tightly from the moment she left the post office until she stepped back into her house, looking for a cook for Morgan Ranch. Room and board included, report at 12 noon on Thursday. Those words seemed to shine a beam of light into a dark corner of Miriam's life, one left unlit for far too long. She read the notice again and again, her fingers brushing its surface as if she feared it might vanish if she let go. In the corner of the kitchen, her 2 children huddled around a pot of thin soup she had made that morning. Thomas, 10 years old, tall and skinny for his age. Lucy, 7, curly-haired, with eyes that always held the tender vulnerability of a child who understood more than she should. They stared into their bowls but kept glancing at their mother, sensing the heavy clouds forming behind her quiet expression. Thomas spoke first, careful and soft. "You've been looking at that paper all morning. Mom, what's going on?" Miriam lifted her head and met her son's eyes. That look, not quite a question, not quite a plea, struck her at the weakest part of her heart. She wanted to answer calmly, but her throat tightened. "I'm just thinking about a few things." "Sweetheart?" Thomas's gaze moved to the paper in her hand. "Are you going somewhere?" Lucy stopped eating, her small spoon frozen midair. Her big eyes widened, full of unspoken worry. "You're not going to leave us, right?" That question felt like a hand wrapping around Miriam's heart and squeezing. She shook her head immediately, dropped to her knees beside them, and pulled both children into her arms. "No, I'm not leaving you. No matter what happens, we stay together, I promise." Lucy leaned into her mother, reassured, but Thomas watched Miriam a little longer, as if searching her face for truths she might be too tired to say aloud. He understood the world in the way children, shaped by loss, often do. Their father had died 2 years earlier in a quarry accident. Since then, Miriam had become not just the sole provider, but the wall that shielded all 3 of them from the storms of life. But every wall cracks eventually. Miriam loosened her hold, looked at the notice again, and in that moment she knew she had no choice left. Their savings were nearly gone. Her side work sewing in the town was drying up, and winter was closing in. They needed an escape. She needed a doorway just wide enough for all 3 of them to pass through. Morgan Ranch. The name wasn't unfamiliar. Everyone in Hawthorne Ridge knew about Caleb Morgan, the widower who lived alone on a stretch of land so large it felt endless, quiet, withdrawn, hard to approach. But no one spoke of him as cruelly as a man carrying a burden of grief too heavy to set down. Miriam brushed her fingers across the paper, then set it down. She rose, walked to a small wooden box on the wall shelf, and took out letter paper, a pen, and an old envelope. She set them on the table and sat. She lit a candle. The soft, golden glow washed over the tabletop. Miriam steadied her hand, though it trembled not from fear, but because the choice she was about to make could change the entire course of their lives. At last, she wrote, "Mr. Morgan, my name is Miriam Dawson. I live east of Hawthorne Ridge. I have 2 young children, Thomas and Lucy. I can cook, I work hard, and I can care for the kitchen and keep the house in order. If you still need a cook, I would like to present myself this Thursday at exactly 12 noon. Respectfully, Miriam Dawson." Her writing quivered slightly but remained clear. No begging, no pleading, just the honesty and resolve of a woman pushed to the edge but still holding her dignity. When she wrote her own name, a strange feeling washed over her, as though for the first time in a long while she was doing something for her life, not merely surviving it. She folded the letter, slipped it into the envelope, and stood. Her body felt lighter, but her heart swirled with questions. What if the man was as cold as people said? What if he didn't want children on his ranch? What if he turned them away the moment he saw the three of them and the one that stung the most? What if he pitied them? Miriam closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, then opened them again with quiet determination. No one was allowed to pity her. She didn't need charity. She only needed a chance to work, to raise her children, to live with dignity. That night, she didn't sleep. She mended Thomas's coat, fixed the hem of Lucy's dress, and packed food for the next day. The small house lay in silence, lit only by candlelight and the whisper of needle and thread. And she knew, deep in the stillness, that the moment this letter reached Caleb Morgan, their lives would shift in a direction none of them could undo. Across the valley, Caleb remained unaware that while he curled deeper into the loneliness of his large, silent home, a woman in a much smaller one was writing the words that would soon guide her and her children through his front door, a door he had no intention of opening for anyone. But sometimes it is the doors left closed the longest that fate chooses to knock on first. Thursday arrived with a colder morning than usual. Fog blanketed the ground like a thin silver sheet, curling around each blade of grass, each stone, each tree trunk lining the road toward Morgan Ranch. The sparrows perched on the Dawson rooftop chirped hesitantly, as if they too sensed something important waiting for the family on the other side of the valley. Miriam woke before dawn. She slipped on an old but still warm knitted sweater, lit the stove to heat the kitchen, and prepared a simple breakfast for the children. Thomas appeared first hair-tousled, eyes still puffed with unfinished sleep. Lucy followed, wearing the pale blue dress Miriam had mended the night before. "You're really going today?" Mom Lucy asked, her voice as soft as morning mist. "I'm not going alone." "You two are coming with me," Miriam replied, bending to tighten the scarf around her daughter's neck. Thomas sat at the table, studying his mother intently. He carried a sensitivity sharper than most adults realized. Finally, in a strangely calm voice, he asked, "What if that man doesn't like us?" Miriam lifted her head, her expression softening. "If he doesn't, then we come home. But I believe we have to try. If we never try, well, never know whether a door is opening for us." The boy nodded, understanding at least part of the burden beneath his mother's steady exterior. They ate breakfast in silence, not a heavy silence, but the kind shared by people gathering courage before stepping into something entirely unknown. As the sun began to rise, Miriam slipped the letter she had prepared into her coat pocket, led the children out to their old wagon, and helped them climb aboard. The wagon was worn, the wheels creaking with each turn, but still sturdy enough to carry the three of them down the long road to Morgan Ranch. Miriam held the reins with hands that trembled lightly, not out of fear, but from the knowledge that if Caleb Morgan took one look at them and shook his head, the fragile hope she had been clinging to would vanish. That scared her enough that her rough, work-worn hands suddenly felt fragile. The wagon rolled forward, following the narrow dirt path between two rows of towering pines. The morning wind carried the scent of sap and mist-familiar notes of the west, though today they felt like hints of a beginning. "Mom," Lucy whispered, scooting closer, "do you think hell like me?" Miriam smiled softly, brushing her daughter's curls. "No one could ever dislike you, but liking isn't what matters. We're going there to work, to live honestly. The rest we leave to the good Lord." Thomas looked ahead, eyes fixed on the small rise leading down into the valley. When the wagon reached the top, Morgan Ranch unfolded before them like a vast painting. The main house stood tall under a pale blue sky, its long porch stretching wide, the horse barn behind it, and fences looping around it all like rough, sturdy arms. Lucy gasped. "It's so big," Thomas swallowed. "Big, but it feels cold." Miriam felt it too. Her gaze lingered on the front window, its faded curtain fluttering in the wind. No laughter, no voices, no warmth, and on the porch steps stood Caleb Morgan, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a long dark brown coat. His wide-brimmed hat shaded part of his face, but not the sharp winter lake stillness of his eyes. As the wagon stopped, he didn't step down from the porch. He simply stood there, arms crossed, studying them. Miriam inhaled deeply. Her grip on the reins tightened. She whispered, "All right, we're here." She climbed down first. The moment her feet touched the ground, her entire body tensed instinctively. Thomas held Lucy's hand as they climbed down after her. The three of them stood together, a small, fragile cluster before a vast house. Caleb watched them silently. A widow, 2 children, an old wagon, a woman with eyes full of hope and fear. He said nothing, only observed, not with judgment, with the bewildered stillness of someone who couldn't remember the last time another soul had approached him this way. At last, Miriam stepped forward. Her hand rose to her coat, and she introduced herself, steady, though her nerves flickered beneath every word. "Mr. Morgan, my name is Miriam Dawson. These are my children, Thomas and Lucy. I'm here to apply for the cooking position you posted." Caleb didn't answer right away. His gaze traveled from Miriam's calloused hands to Lucy's hopeful eyes, then to Thomas standing tall, trying his best not to look afraid despite the way his fingers clenched. He finally asked, voice deep and steady, "Do you have experience cooking for a ranch?" Miriam met his gaze head-on. No flinching, no retreat. "I cooked for the quarry workers before. I can bake bread, make soups, stew meat, and keep the kitchen clean." Caleb nodded slightly. He looked at the children again, then asked a question that caught Miriam off guard. "They'll be living here as well." Miriam tightened her hold on Lucy's hand. Her voice dropped lower but stayed firm. "I can't leave them behind. If you need a cook but you don't want children here, he'll leave right now. But I have to be honest, they're all I have." Caleb was silent. Each second dragged out like a rope pulled endlessly through her chest. She could almost hear her heartbeat. Then he asked, unexpectedly, "Can you start today?" Thomas let out a breath so quietly that Miriam turned to him, realizing he'd been holding it since the conversation began. Lucy squeezed her mother's hand, her eyes suddenly glowing. Miriam bowed her head, her voice trembling with relief. "If you'll have us, he'll start right away." Caleb turned, opened the front door, and spoke short and plain, but not as cold as before. "Then come in. The kitchen's to the left. There's plenty to do, not a warm welcome, but not a rejection." For Miriam, that was enough. She and the children followed him, and as the door of Morgan Ranch opened, Miriam felt as though she were stepping into a new world, strange, uncertain, challenging, yet possibly the place destiny had meant for them all along. She did not know that the man walking ahead of her was feeling something almost identical. And for the first time in many years, inside Morgan Ranch there was human warmth again. The first morning at Morgan Ranch unfolded in a silence solid as stone. The old kitchen door creaked softly when Miriam pushed it open. She paused at the threshold, taking in the wide room as a shaft of early sunlight streamed through the small window, laying a pale stripe of light across the wooden counter. The air held the smell of old dust, leftover ash in the stove, and the metallic tang of pots untouched for far too long. It felt like she had stepped into a room forgotten by time. Miriam inhaled deeply. She set her small basket on the table, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. First, she opened the window to let the breeze sweep away the stale dampness. Then she scooped out ash from the stove, scrubbed away layers of grime, and wiped each spoon, each plate, with the patient determination she had earned through years of hardship. Her hands moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew how to turn even the most neglected places into something livable. "Do you need help?" "Mom," Thomas stood at the doorway, careful, as if afraid he might interrupt. Miriam turned. Her eyes softened. "You can bring water from the well for me." "Well, need plenty today." The boy nodded and ran off. Lucy wanted to help too, but Miriam kept her close. The little girl reorganized the old wooden utensils under her mother's direction, eyes glowing with excitement. It had been months since Lucy had seen her mother smile a peaceful smile like this. Even if faint as mist, it was still a rare, precious smile. Just as Miriam lit the stove, Caleb appeared in the doorway. He stood there silently, taking everything in. His shadow stretched across the kitchen floor, his posture firm and unmoving. "You're cleaning a lot," Caleb said, his tone unreadable, neither approval nor criticism. "A clean kitchen makes better meals," Miriam replied, calm and steady. Caleb nodded. His gaze moved around the room, as if he were seeing his own kitchen for the first time in years. This place had once belonged to his mother. She had died when he was young, and since then, the room had lost the scent of baked bread and herbs. Only silence and old air had remained. He stepped further inside. Lucy instinctively hid behind her mother's leg. Caleb looked at the girl, then at Miriam. "Will the children be all right here?" Miriam answered gently. "We just need a chance to live decently. I don't want to trouble you." Caleb studied her longer than one would expect, not out of curiosity, but because something in her eyes made it hard for him to look away. A quiet steadiness, a softness shaped by old wounds, something that, without explanation, reminded him of himself. He only said, "Lunch today. I want bread and stew. Ranch hands will be back on time." Miriam nodded. "He'll have everything ready." Caleb lingered a moment, then left. When his shadow vanished through the doorway, Lucy whispered, "He looks sad, doesn't he, Mom?" Miriam stood still. She glanced toward the door where the morning light still spilled through. She understood completely. Some sorrows were never spoken aloud, but showed themselves in how someone walked, how they stood, how they looked at a house that no longer held a voice waiting for them. Caleb Morgan was the kind of man who carried silence heavy enough to make others afraid to disturb it. All morning, Miriam worked with unwavering focus. Thomas pulled water from the well again and again until sweat streaked down his temples. But he kept going. Lucy arranged 3 old cups on the shelf, careful not to chip them. Near noon, Miriam began the stew. She chopped onions, sliced carrots, and cut the meat into even pieces. She worked slowly, as if pouring part of her own heart into the dish. When the smell of simmering meat and vegetables filled the kitchen, Lucy exclaimed, "Mom, it smells so good." Miriam smiled gently, like a rare peaceful dawn in the wind-blown west. That was when Caleb reappeared. He stood at the doorway, giving a small, unreadable nod. "The smell reminds me of home," he said quietly. Miriam froze for a second. No one expected him to say something like that. Yet he did, and the room warmed in a way she didn't expect. "Thank you," she murmured, unable to keep a hint of emotion from her voice. Caleb paused, then asked, "What will the children eat? He'll prepare something separately for them." Miriam answered, "We don't want to bother anyone." Caleb shook his head. "They eat with me and the crew. No need for divisions." The words surprised her, not because they were kind, but because they came from a man who looked like he had forgotten what warmth felt like. When the ranch hands returned for lunch, they were startled to find the kitchen clean, the table neat, and the air filled with the scent of real food. When Miriam set the pot of stew on the table, they looked at her with a mix of curiosity and quiet gratitude. Caleb entered last. He took his usual seat, glanced around the table, then nodded permission to begin. The first spoonfuls brought a complete hush, not an awkward silence, but the silence of people rediscovering something they didn't know they missed a proper meal, made with care. Caleb ate slowly, one spoon at a time. His face didn't change much, but his eyes softened. This was the first time in years he had eaten stew that wasn't thrown together in haste. When the meal ended, he set down his spoon and spoke a rare sentence in front of everyone: "You cook well." Miriam bowed her head slightly. "Thank you." The ranch hands exchanged looks. None of them had ever heard Caleb praise someone, especially not in a room full of people. That day, Miriam sensed something clearly. Morgan Ranch's atmosphere had shifted. Only a little, but every change begins with something small. That afternoon, while Thomas followed the ranch hands to the stables to watch them train horses, and Lucy helped her mother tidy up. Caleb stood on the porch looking out over the wide fields. He said nothing, but inside him, something stirred, slow, quiet, but unmistakably present. A widow and her 2 children had arrived at Morgan Ranch like a warm wind at winter's end. He didn't know how his life was about to change, but he could feel it. The old wagon hadn't just brought him a cook. It might have brought back something long lost, something he once believed he would never have again. That evening, Morgan Ranch settled into the pale orange glow of dusk. The last light of day stretched across the wooden fences and slipped through patches of dry grass, bathing the place in a rare, gentle warmth. Miriam stood on the back porch of the kitchen, rinsing a cloth in cold well water. Lucy had fallen into a late nap after a long day, and Thomas was out by the stables with Hank the ranch hand, who had been there longer than anyone could remember. The quiet was so peaceful Miriam almost forgot the weight she carried. She stood there for a good while, letting the breeze touch her face, carrying with it the scent of scorched grass and dry timber, the fragrance of the West itself. She didn't hear footsteps at first. What startled her wasn't the sound, but the familiar silence that followed it. Caleb stood a few paces behind her. He didn't surprise her with noise. He surprised her by simply being there. "I didn't expect you to scrub the entire pantry by noon," he said, voice steady but not cold. Miriam hung the cloth on the line and turned toward him. "Where I worked before, I did the same whenever I had the chance. Cleaning a place makes me feel a little less lost." Caleb tilted his head slightly, as if he understood the deeper meaning beneath her words. "You don't have a home anymore, do you?" he asked quietly. Miriam froze. That wound, though familiar, still stung when touched. "No," she replied, her breath thin. She didn't elaborate, and Caleb didn't press. His gaze drifted toward the open fields, where the sun was sinking behind the far mountains. "I lost mine too," he said softly. Miriam didn't move. She didn't interrupt. The first glimpse of Caleb's past hung in the air between them, stretching a quiet line of tension, not uncomfortable, but full of unsaid things. Caleb continued. "After my mother died, this kitchen stopped smelling like real food. I left it that way, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't want anyone stepping into my life again." Miriam swallowed. That simple honesty, quiet, unembellished, hit her harder than any dramatic confession could have. "You've lived alone that long?" she asked. Caleb nodded, probably too long. It was a plain admission, direct, without self-pity, and because of that, it struck something deep inside her. They stood side by side for several silent minutes, the wind threading through the old porch boards beneath their feet. At last, Caleb spoke again. "Tonight, I want you to eat with us, No formality. Thomas and Lucy, too. Miriam was so surprised she hesitated before answering. I don't want to intrude. It's not an intrusion. This is your ranch now, too. Caleb's voice was firm, but not forceful. The words made Miriam's heart shift, just a little. She opened her mouth to protest, then stopped. She simply nodded. Thank you. Caleb didn't look directly at her, but something in his eyes softened. That evening, when everyone gathered around for bowls of Miriam's simple soup, the meal unfolded naturally, so much so that even she didn't expect it to feel this easy. The ranch hands swapped stories about the season's work, the cattle, and how last year's winter arrived early. Laughter rose now and then, blending with the gentle clinking of spoons and dishes. Lucy sat beside her mother, eating each spoonful with solemn focus, though her eyes kept wandering toward Caleb, as if trying to understand him. Thomas blended in even faster, asking Hank questions about shoeing horses. Caleb remained quiet, as usual, but he watched more closely than he meant to. Whenever someone spoke to Miriam, he noticed. When Lucy giggled at something Thomas said, he heard it. When Miriam leaned over to adjust her daughter's napkin, he watched with an almost startled attention, as though the simple gesture was something foreign in this long, empty house. Miriam felt that gaze. Not possessive, not prying, just a presence warm enough that her back felt less cold. They didn't speak much during dinner, but the silence between them no longer felt like the distance of strangers. After supper, Lucy grew sleepy early, and Miriam carried her to the small room Caleb had prepared. Thomas stayed behind to help Hank at the stables. Miriam then went to the grain shed to sort sacks of flour and grain. A few minutes later, Caleb joined her, carrying an oil lamp. He set it on the rough wooden table. "Why aren't you resting?" he asked. Miriam gave a small smile. "I'm used to working late. In places like this, working is how you stay upright." Caleb was silent for a few seconds, then leaned a hand on one of the grain sacks. "Thomas is a good kid. Learns quickly." Miriam looked up, her voice softening. "He wanted to be the man of the house the day his father died, but is still just a boy. I'm afraid he'll lose his childhood too soon." Caleb met her eyes, his gaze deeper than usual. "You've done everything you could. It's not your fault." Her eyes warmed. The quiet reassurance didn't try to fix anything. It somehow reached the deepest corner of her exhaustion. She turned away briefly, steadying herself. After a moment, she asked, "You don't mind Thomas being out at the stables, do you?" "No, he's brave, and he's a good kid. Hank says he asks a lot of questions," Caleb said, a hint of pride slipping in. Miriam laughed softly. "He gets that from his father. Never could keep a question to himself." Caleb glanced sideways at her. "What about you?" Miriam blinked. "Do you keep your questions to yourself?" She looked down at her hands. "I keep many things, because sometimes saying them out loud doesn't make the burden any lighter." Caleb nodded, the understanding so genuine it sent a faint shiver through her. "I'm the same way." In that moment, something subtle shifted, closing half the distance between them. Not romance, not intimacy, just the rare recognition between two people who had been hurt deeply in their own ways. Night had fully fallen when they walked out of the grain shed. The wind carried the scent of dry earth and cold air. Above them, the stars shone crisp and bright. Miriam walked a few steps ahead. When she turned to say good night, Caleb was standing at the bottom of the porch steps, the light from inside brushing against his hair. "Good night," he said quietly. "Good night, Mr. Morgan," she replied. Caleb watched her for a moment longer than usual. Then, in a low, sincere voice, he added, "Thank you for today." Miriam stilled. She bowed her head slightly in response. Then she brushed a hand over Lucy's sleeping hair, as if sealing that fragile warmth that had slipped into their lives. Caleb watched the small family for a few seconds more before heading inside. For the first time in years, his footsteps felt lighter. Miriam glanced back at him, a quiet thought rising in her mind. Perhaps this place isn't just a job. Perhaps this is where the three of them might begin again. Morning arrived at Morgan Ranch with an unusual stillness. The sky hung heavier than usual, gray clouds stacking like weighted blankets over the far mountains, an omen of bad weather rolling in. Miriam had just added water to a pot to reheat breakfast when a distant rumble of thunder drifted across the valley, a low, crawling sound that felt like the earth itself exhaling. Caleb stepped into the kitchen just as she was feeding more wood into the stove. He wore a dark leather coat, his boots smeared with mud that left heavy footprints on the wooden floor. His gaze flicked toward the window where the horizon had grown darker. "Storm's comin'. Heavy one," he said, voice steady but his eyes edged with caution. Miriam nodded gently. "I heard the thunder while I was out by the well. Do you think it'll get bad?" Caleb looked at her, and for a moment something old and familiar flickered behind his eyes. "In this region, storms blow in as fast as breath. If the wind shifts, it could knock the whole horse barn sideways." Miriam's fingers tightened on her apron. After the last 2 years of unexpected hardship, she had learned to fear anything that arrived suddenly, anything strong enough to sweep away the little her family had left. Caleb caught that worry in her face. "Everything here is reinforced." "You don't need to worry too much," he said, his voice lower, softer. Miriam turned toward him, surprised by the rare note of concern. She offered a small smile, but it barely took shape before Thomas burst into the kitchen, breathless. "Ma, Mr. Morgan, some of the cattle up north are crowding together. They look scared." Caleb straightened immediately, eyes sharpening. That means the wind already shifted. He strode toward the porch, Thomas rushing behind him. Miriam hesitated only a heartbeat before lifting Lucy into her arms and following them outside. Across the open fields, sagebrush bent sharply under gusts of rising wind. In the distance, the herd churned in confusion. The cold draft slapped against Miriam's face, making Lucy cling tighter. Caleb spoke quickly. "Miriam, take Lucy inside. Shut the windows. Thomas and I will check the herd before the rain hits." Thomas looked up at him, eyes wide. "Can I go with you?" Caleb paused, studying the boy, weighing the risk. Then, "All right, but you stay right beside me. No wandering." "Understood." Thomas nodded hard like someone entrusted with a great mission. Miriam instinctively wanted to refuse. But when she saw the look in her son's eyes, a boy desperate for a chance to grow, she only took his shoulders and said, "Be careful. Do exactly as he says. I promise, Mom." Miriam watched them run toward the northern fence as the wind grew wild enough to tug the fabric of her sleeves. She held Lucy close, trying to keep fear from taking over. Meanwhile, Caleb and Thomas followed the fence line. The sky was nearly black now, the clouds closing in like a lowering curtain. Gusts of wind slapped against their faces, forcing Thomas to squint. "Mr. Morgan, I'm not scared," Thomas said, his voice trembling just slightly. Caleb glanced at him and for a heartbeat saw another boy, one from long ago. Himself. The courage was familiar, painfully familiar. "We need to get the cattle into the barn before the rain breaks. You open the gate. He'll drive them in." "All right." Thomas nodded, jaw set. They reached the herd just as thunder cracked overhead, making several cows spook. Caleb motioned for Thomas to step back. "Keep your distance. They can bolt your way. Yes." "Sir." Caleb swung his rope, pushing the herd inwards. Thomas pulled the gate open just as instructed. After 10 chaotic minutes of battling wind, dust, and panicked animals, most of the herd was safely inside, all except one pregnant cow trembling, standing apart from the others. Caleb stared at her, then at Thomas. She's carrying a calf. She spooks easy. He'll have to guide her myself. Can I help? Thomas asked, voice steady with determination. Caleb was about to say no, but the boy's eyes clear, loyal, brave made him pause. Stand right here. He'll drive her from behind. If she runs your way, spread your arms and yell, shell turn off. Thomas gulped, then nodded. Caleb moved toward the cow carefully, but just as he began to steer her, a bolt of lightning split the sky, so bright it washed the world white for a second. The cow panicked. She bolted straight toward Thomas. Thomas, back up! Caleb shouted, but the wind smothered half his voice. The boy froze, fear rooting his feet. Caleb threw the rope aside and lunged. In one fierce motion, he grabbed Thomas by the shoulders and yanked him clear. The cow thundered past them, sending a spray of dirt over both of them. Thomas fell, Caleb shielding him with his own body, breath ragged. You all right? Yes, I think so, Thomas whispered, lips pale. Caleb held the boy's head for a moment, confirming he was unharmed. Then he stood, watching the frightened cow disappear into the sheets of building rain. Under his breath, barely audible, Caleb said, I won't lose anyone. Not again. By the time they made it back to the house, the storm unleashed its full force. Rain slammed the earth in wild sheets. Miriam stood frozen on the porch, Lucy in her arms, her face drained of color. When she saw Caleb leading Thomas safely up the steps, she rushed forward. She pulled her son so tightly to her chest he gave a small grunt. Mom can't breathe, he murmured. But Miriam couldn't let go. Rain mixed with her tears, and she couldn't tell which tasted saltier. Caleb stood a short distance away, soaked to the bone, hair plastered over his brow. He watched the mother and child, and something in his eyes softened so deeply it was almost hidden. Miriam turned to him, her voice breaking. Thank you, thank you. Caleb shook his head once. Thomas did well, braver than I was at his age. Thomas lifted his eyes proud, shaken, alive. Miriam brushed her son's wet hair aside, then looked back at Caleb. The look she gave him held more than gratitude. It carried trust, something she hadn't offered any man since the day her husband died. The storm still roared outside, but under the porch of Morgan Ranch, 3 figures stood together. A man whose old wounds still burned quietly, a woman trying to rebuild a life, and a boy who had just taken one more step into grownhood. They stood close enough that the invisible distances between them began to crack. The storm that night lasted longer than any storm Miriam had ever lived through. The wind howled in sharp bursts, pounding against the windows as if trying to break its way in. Rain hammered the tin roof in relentless rhythms, making the old house tremble with every rolling beat. Lucy stirred now and then whenever thunder cracked overhead, while Thomas, exhausted after the ordeal in the field, had fallen asleep almost as soon as his head hit the pillow. Miriam sat beside his bed, her hand brushing gently over his hair, still stiff from dried rain. She couldn't erase the image of him nearly being struck by the panicked cow. That moment had cut through her like a blade reminding her how much she had already lost, and how she could not, would not, lose anything more. When Thomas' breathing steadied, Miriam rose, closed the door softly behind her, and stepped out onto the porch. The storm showed no sign of easing. The wind was so cold she had to cross her arms just to keep warm. In the gloom, she spotted Caleb standing by the fence. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a long rain-soaked coat, unmoving despite the fury of the storm around him. He stood there like a carved figure hewn straight from the land itself, enduring, silent, alone. Miriam watched him for a moment before walking down from the porch, her shoes soaked instantly in the wet ground. "Mr. Morgan," she called softly, "you'll catch a cold if you stay out here." Caleb didn't turn right away. When he finally did, the porch lantern cast only half his face in light, but it was enough for her to see the heavy fatigue shadowing his eyes. "I don't feel cold," he replied, his voice deeper than usual. Miriam lingered, then said gently, "The wind's strong. You should come inside." Caleb inhaled slowly, a heavy breath, thick with something he'd held down for years. "The cattle are safe, the barn's locked tight. There's no reason for me to be out here except trying to quiet my head." Miriam understood instantly. People stood in storms for only one reason, because something inside them was louder than the thunder outside. She stepped closer. "You were very brave today." Caleb looked at her with a mix of disbelief and something harder to name. "No, I just did what any ranch owner should." Miriam shook her head faintly. "Not everyone would risk themselves to save my son." Caleb lowered his gaze, rain tapping rhythmically on the brim of his hat. The storm raged, but between them lay a stillness sharp as a held breath. At length, he spoke, voice roughened. "I couldn't let the boy get hurt. I once didn't reach someone in time." Miriam didn't move. She knew this wasn't a moment to press. She simply waited patient. Steady, the way only those who've survived deep wounds know how to wait. Caleb leaned on the fence and stared into the dark fields as if searching the shadows for the ghost of someone he'd lost. "My wife, she died after giving birth to our first child. I tried to get home as fast as I could when they came to fetch me. But by the time I arrived, it was already too late." The wind slammed against the porch roof like the land itself was grieving with him. Miriam stayed silent, letting the space between them breathe. Caleb went on. "I spent years trying to figure out how to punish myself. I blamed myself for being away, for working too much, for not standing beside her in her last moment. I dug through every memory, every choice, trying to find where I went wrong." Miriam looked at his hands still wet with rain, the same hands that had saved Thomas' life just hours ago. She suddenly understood the sheer, crushing loneliness this man had carried. Finally, she whispered, "You can't save everyone. None of us can." Caleb gave a small, bitter laugh. "I know, but knowing isn't always enough." Lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the exhaustion etched into his face, a familiar look in those who've lived with a wound too deep, too long. Miriam stepped a half-pace closer. "I used to think that if it'd been there the day my husband had his accident, I could have saved him. I punished myself for almost 2 years. Until one day Lucy asked if it was my fault, and that's when I realized sometimes our pain stops being ours alone." Caleb looked at her for a long time, like her words had struck a place he never let anyone near. She continued, voice steady but soft. "You lost your wife. I lost my husband. We can't rewrite the past, but we can choose whether to go on living or let the pain swallow us whole." Caleb lifted his gaze to the sky. The rain was easing, but the wind remained cold. He said nothing. Miriam didn't touch him or coax him. She simply stood beside him. Her presence felt like something he hadn't felt in years. After a long while, he turned to her. For the first time since she arrived, his voice wavered just slightly. "I've never told anyone here about this." Miriam offered a gentle smile, warm enough to soften the storm between them. "That's because you never had someone to tell, until now." Caleb bowed his head a little, as if acknowledging the truth of it. By the time they returned to the porch, the storm had finally broken. The sky faded from black to a soft gray, the kind of color that comes only after something fierce has passed. The air smelled of wet earth, of cleansing. Caleb opened the door for her. Miriam paused, then said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear, "Thank you for trusting me." Caleb stood still, eyes following her in the glow of the lantern, quiet, steady, deeper than a well. "Good night, Miriam," he said, voice low. "Good night, Mr. Morgan." The door closed between them, but both of them knew something else had opened, an invisible door one no storm could ever shut again. The morning after the storm, Morgan Ranch looked as if it had been washed clean. Early sunlight filtered through the leftover clouds, casting pale golden streaks across the rain-soaked fields. The ground was still soft, and the rich scent of damp earth mingled with the fresh breath of dawn, carrying a strangely new sense of renewal. In the kitchen, Miriam stood by the stove, stirring a pot of steaming corn porridge. The rising heat brushed her face, wrapping her in a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. She couldn't tell if it was the smell of the porridge or the memory of the conversation from the night before, how it had quietly opened a corner of her heart she always kept sealed. Either way. This morning her spirit felt calmer than usual. Lucy sat on a small chair near the window, legs swinging, her eyes fixed on the droplets still clinging to the tree branches outside. "Mom, the sky looks so clean today, like someone wiped it shiny." Miriam let out a soft laugh. "Yes, heavy rain often leaves the sky brand new," Lucy asked, her voice still thick with sleepiness. "Did Mr. Morgan really stand out in the rain last night?" Miriam paused. She didn't want to share Caleb's private burdens with the child, so she answered only what was necessary. "He was watching over the cattle, on a ranch. Sometimes you stay up all night to keep everything safe." Lucy nodded thoughtfully, then turned back to the window. She seemed to be settling into this place, as though Morgan Ranch carried a rhythm that children's hearts adapted to more easily than adults. The sound of the front door opening made Miriam turn. Caleb stepped into the kitchen, his coat still dotted with drops of early morning dew from checking the fences. His boots were muddy but had been wiped down. He looked tired, but his eyes were clearer than usual. "Corn porridge?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with surprise. Miriam nodded. "I figured everyone could use something warm after a night like that." Caleb glanced around the kitchen. The steam from the pot, the gentle scent of milk and butter drifting in the air, it all gave the room a tender kind of life. He stood quietly for a moment before saying, "It's been a long time since this kitchen felt warm." The admission made Miriam still for a heartbeat. Something subtle stirred in her chest, not pity, but a soft tremor at hearing such a man say such a thing. Hank and a few ranch hands entered shortly after, damp with morning mist. When they saw the pot already set out on the table, they smiled at Miriam shy, grateful smiles from men not used to being cared for this way at sunrise. "One bowl for Hank, Mom," Thomas called as he came in through the back door, bright-eyed and proud as though he'd taken charge of the whole kitchen. Caleb glanced at the boy, and something in his gaze softened. The boy was changing, growing by the hour. Miriam handed Hank his bowl, then set portions for Thomas and Lucy on the table. But when it came to Caleb's serving, she hesitated. Part of her worried he'd refuse. He wasn't the type to accept being taken care of. But Caleb accepted the bowl without a word, giving only a brief nod. And that alone told Miriam he was slowly letting someone into the private space he'd guarded for so many years. When everyone gathered around the table, the breakfast unfolded so naturally that Miriam found herself quietly amazed. Lucy talked about spotting a tiny rainbow after the storm. Hank described a section of fence the wind had snapped in two. Thomas peppered him with questions about giving medicine to horses when they were sick. Caleb stayed mostly silent, as always, but he watched everything, and even without speaking, Miriam could sense the gradual shift in him. Breakfast ended with gentle clinks of spoons against bowls. When the ranch hands filed out, Miriam stayed behind to clear the table. Caleb remained as well, leaning against the kitchen doorway, arms crossed as if weighing something in his mind. "Miriam," he said softly. She looked up. "Yes." Caleb exhaled slowly, as though deciding whether or not to speak the thought he'd been holding. "Yesterday, I thanked you for listening. But this morning I realized I should thank you for something else." Miriam blinked. "For what?" Caleb glanced at the pot still resting on the stove. "For bringing warmth back into this house. It's been a long time since this place felt alive." Miriam froze. His words weren't praise, they were a confession, gentle, but deep enough to send a quiet tremor through her chest. She answered softly, without looking away. "I should thank you, too, for letting the three of us stay here." Caleb pressed his lips together for a moment, then asked, "Last night you didn't sleep well, did you?" Miriam smiled faintly. "I'm afraid of thunder, and I was worried about Thomas." Caleb nodded. Clearly, he understood the nameless fears that lived inside a mother. "If anything ever troubles you, tell me. On this ranch, I want you to feel safe." The words caught Miriam in the throat. She wasn't used to anyone offering protection. For 2 years she'd done everything alone, her work, her burdens, even her grief. After a moment, she said, "Thank you, Mr. Morgan. He'll remember that." Sunlight slipped through the window and lit Caleb's face with a calm glow. He watched her for a long, quiet second before stepping out to the fields. When he was gone, Miriam stood still. She laid a hand on the table, feeling the lingering warmth from the pot, then looked around the tidy kitchen. For the first time, it didn't feel like a workplace. It felt like a home. The rest of the day slipped by gently. Thomas followed Hank to help repair the fence, proud to be trusted with real work. Lucy helped Miriam wash the vegetables and hang the cloths that had gotten soaked in the storm. The ranch buzzed with movement, yet everything felt peaceful. Toward late afternoon, as Miriam hung a white towel on the porch line, she noticed Caleb in the distance, arms folded as he watched Thomas and Hank work. He said nothing, but his expression held a touch of pride, a bit of relief, and something else she couldn't quite name. When he turned back, his gaze met hers. Neither looked away, neither spoke, but the invisible space between them, once as wide as the field, shad drawn closer, close enough to understand, still far enough that neither dared take the next step. The afternoon drifted by with the warm, steady breath of the west after a storm. Most of the gray clouds had finally dissolved, revealing a clear sky stretched out like a soft blue blanket. The air carried the scent of wet grass and rain-soaked earth, making every corner of Morgan Ranch feel quietly alive. In the kitchen, Miriam stood at the big wooden table, her hands moving with practiced ease as she worked with the set of knives she'd brought from her old home. On the table lay a cut of tender beef rubbed with black pepper and garlic, and beside it a pot of red beans simmering with slow, gentle bubbles. The small kitchen pulsed with soft sounds, the kneading of dough, the steady crackle of firewood under the stove. Sounds that soothed her heart, like she'd rediscovered a small piece of normal she hadn't touched in a long time. Lucy helped pick through beans while Thomas stayed outside with Hank at the stables, racing the daylight to finish repairing the storm-battered fence. By the time the sky turned a deep twilight blue, the oil lamps had already been lit. Miriam set dinner on the table, and only then, standing in the golden glow of the kitchen, did she realize this would be the first real dinner the entire ranch shared since she arrived. Something warm rose in her chest, a little flutter, a strange feeling, like she was stepping into a world she'd only dared to dream about. Footsteps from outside made her pause. Caleb entered first. His shirt still carried dust from the fields. His hair was slightly rumpled after a long day outdoors. But his eyes were clear, deep, and quiet, like the night sky settling after a storm. "Smells wonderful," he said, his voice low and careful. Miriam nodded, keeping her tone steady. "Just a simple dinner, Mr. Morgan." Caleb gave a faint shake of his head. "There's nothing simple about it. This house hasn't had a supper worth coming home to in a long, long time." The words weren't poetic, but they went straight to her heart. For a brief moment, she caught something in his gaze, loneliness that had sat in silence for years, a loneliness that never cried out but squeezed his breath a little tighter every day. Soon, Hank and the ranch hands filed in, shaking off their hats, brushing away the last patches of mud, and taking their seats. Thomas joined them, his face lighting up at the sight of the pot of stewed beans and the golden cornbread. Dinner began with a shy quietness, but within minutes the room filled with the sound of spoons clinking and easy conversation. They talked about the new reins Caleb bought, about a cow that had just calved, about how the storm had left the pond full of tiny fish. Simple stories, nothing grand, nothing dramatic, but somehow they breathed a humble life into the room. Caleb sat at the head of the table, eating quietly, listening quietly. Yet Miriam saw something different about him tonight. His shoulders seemed relaxed. His gaze no longer carried the cold edge of the Montana mountains. He listened to Thomas as if he truly cared what the boy said. He nodded at Lucy when she proudly announced she'd learned how to chop vegetables. And when Miriam laid more cornbread in front of him, Caleb looked up and spoke two small words that made her pause. "Thank you." Those two words, from him, carried the weight of something far deeper than politeness. They felt like acceptance, like he'd finally cracked open the door he'd kept shut inside his heart. Dinner passed in a warmth this house hadn't felt in years. When everyone finished, Thomas ran outside to look at the stars. Lucy helped pick up the last of the dishes. Hank headed back to the bunkhouse. Soon, only Caleb and Miriam remained in the kitchen as it slowly settled into quiet. He stood near the door, one hand resting lightly against the old wooden frame worn down by time. "Today was a good day," Caleb said, his voice low, as though he'd just realized it himself. Miriam turned to face him. The oil lamp's gentle light softened both their faces, making the moment feel hazy yet strangely close. "I'm glad to hear that," she answered. Caleb stepped forward, not too close, but enough that the distance between them felt suddenly small. His breath mingled with the scent of cornbread and warm wood. Miriam couldn't quite tell if her heart was steady or trembling. "When the storm hit yesterday," Caleb began, eyes dropping slightly, as though searching for the right words, "I thought I'd gotten used to fear. But when I look toward your house, I realize there are things I'm still afraid to lose." Miriam drew in a soft, unsteady breath. "You don't have to force yourself to say anything," she whispered. "No, I need to say this. All this time, I thought silence would keep the old pain asleep, but silence has a sound of its own, and sometimes that sound is lonelier than the storm." The honesty in his voice gentled something deep inside her. She replied quietly, with a warmth like lamplight, "Morgan, every one of us carries our own wounds. We hold them like shadows that never quite leave. But sometimes a shadow feels less frightening when someone chooses to sit with you in it." Caleb lifted his gaze to hers. In that moment, Miriam saw something shift behind his eyes. Not love, not yet. Not a sudden spark, but trust. The kind of trust he hadn't offered anyone in years. He murmured, "Thank you, Miriam." His voice was so soft she almost didn't hear it. Outside, Thomas laughed as he chased Hank's little dog. Lucy called after him. The wind brushed the porch with a gentle whisper. All of it wove together into an evening so peaceful it tightened Miriam's throat. She turned to fill a cup with water. "You should rest. There'll be plenty to fix tomorrow. The storm left quite a mess." Caleb nodded, but before he stepped out, he paused at the doorway, one hand on the old wooden frame, and looked at her once more. "Miriam, I've lived in silence for a long time, but maybe it's time I learned how not to be alone in it." The door closed softly behind him, and only then did Miriam realize her hand was trembling, not from fear, but because her heart had just trembled quietly, unexpectedly, a small tremor that told her that even though both of them carried their scars, perhaps they were beginning to walk under the same sky. And maybe this was only the beginning. The next morning was so clear that the distant mountain ranges looked as if someone had redrawn them with sharper, cleaner lines. After the storm, the land wore a new color, fresh but not harsh, gentle but full of the quiet strength that defined the West. The early summer wind carried the scent of young grass, and the earth still held the faint breath of last night's rain. Miriam woke earlier than usual, as though sleep had grown lighter after her conversation with Caleb. She didn't say it out loud, but she knew something in her heart had shifted. Not quite hope, not yet a defined feeling, but trust delicate, fragile, and just enough to make her greet the morning with a lighter spirit. In the kitchen, she lit the stove, brewed coffee, and prepared cornbread for breakfast. The crackle of firewood blended with the soft morning breeze outside, creating a peaceful chorus only ranch mornings could have. Lucy came in first, hugging her little pillow like she always did. "Mom, I slept really well last night. I heard the rain, but I wasn't scared anymore." Miriam smiled and brushed her daughter's hair. "That's good. Storms can be scary, but the sky always clears afterwards." Lucy hesitated for a moment. "Is it because Mr. Morgan makes me feel safe?" "Mom." Miriam paused. Children always saw the things adults tried to hide. She knelt down and answered gently. "Yes, partly because of that." Lucy's face lit up as she wrapped her arms around her mother. Miriam stood still for a few seconds, feeling the warmth of her daughter's embrace, and in that moment, she realized Morgan Ranch was slowly becoming a place that truly sheltered them, a place to rebuild a life, not just a temporary stop. Outside, the sound of hooves approached. Caleb had returned early, likely after checking the northern hill as he always did after heavy rain. He stepped into the kitchen, placed his hat on the table, his breath still tinged with the chill of dawn. Miriam handed him a fresh cup of hot coffee. He took it, and something softened in his eyes. "Thank you." His voice carried that familiar ruggedness of the ranch, but something new rested in it too, something warm that didn't come from the steam rising off the cup. Breakfast passed simply, with the quiet discipline of Western life. Afterward, Caleb told Hank and Thomas they needed to check the eastern fences where cattle might be gotten separated during the storm. Thomas was so excited he nearly dropped the piece of cornbread in his hand. Miriam watched the three of them head out. Thomas walked beside Hank while Caleb led the way, steady, grounded, almost untouched by the storm, as though nothing could shake the strongest parts of him. The morning drifted by as Miriam cleaned the kitchen and hung yesterday's washed linens out to dry. She felt the world around her shift not because of the weather, but because her heart was no longer as tightly closed. Near noon, Lucy ran inside. "Mom, Mr. Morgan and the others are back." Before Miriam could respond, the back door opened and Caleb stepped in. His shirt was dusty, and there were scratches along his forearm. Miriam's worry flared instantly. "Mr. Morgan, what happened?" Caleb shook his head. "It's nothing. Just a branch. A cow got stuck down a rocky hollow. We had to climb in and pull her up." Miriam looked at the scratches, then at him. She picked up a clean cloth, dampened it with warm water, and moved toward him. Caleb tensed for a moment. Maybe he wasn't used to anyone tending to him. "You don't need to." Miriam cut him off, her tone gentle but firm. "Let me see the injury." Caleb grew quiet. He extended his arm, letting her tend to him. Miriam wiped the scratches gently, each movement slow and careful. When the cloth brushed his skin, she could feel the warmth of his strong, weathered arm, and Caleb felt something too, because for a brief second, his eyes lingered on her face. "That's too much worry for a small scrape," Caleb muttered softly. Miriam answered in a breeze-light voice, "Out here, if one person goes down, everyone struggles. I'm only doing what needs to be done." Caleb stayed silent for a long moment. Miriam knew he wanted to say something he wasn't ready to speak aloud. Instead, he looked at the cloth in her hand and whispered, "It's been a long time since anyone bandaged a wound for me." The words made her slow her movements. In that quiet instant, she understood another layer of his loneliness, a deep one. The afternoon passed peacefully, but by evening everything changed. Hank stepped into the kitchen looking uneasy. "Boss, there's a stranger at the gate." Caleb froze, his eyes sharpened, losing the calm they'd held all day. Miriam sensed it immediately. Something important had brushed against his past. "Did you recognize him?" Caleb asked. Hank shook his head. "No, but he wants to speak to you. Says it's urgent." Caleb placed his hat on the table and walked out to the front porch. Miriam continued her chores but kept glancing at his shadow stretching long against the sunset. It felt heavy, ominous, as if whatever was happening would not be simple. Voices murmured outside low, indistinct. Then Caleb stepped back in. His face was tight, cold as a drawn bowstring. He spoke slowly, each word settling like a weight on the table. A group of men showed up near the southern valley. They burned the O'Connor camp. Signs point to bandits from down south. Miriam froze. The air in the kitchen fell still. "Mr. Morgan, will they come here?" Caleb looked at her, not hiding the concern in his gaze. "I don't know yet, but I need to be prepared." Miriam swallowed hard. She wasn't fragile, but she understood Western danger better than most. Thomas and Lucy were here. That truth pierced her deeper than fear itself. Caleb took one step toward her, his voice softer. "Don't be afraid. I won't let anything happen to you or the children." His tone remained low and steady, but carried a weight that made Miriam's heart sway. It felt like a promise, a simple one, a solid one, and in that moment she understood something very real. Caleb Morgan wasn't just the ranch owner. He was a man who could stand in the middle of a storm without trembling, a man she could lean on, and she would not fall. But that realization made her heart tremble, because summer had arrived, and with it came winds of change no one could predict. After the stranger left, night fell faster than usual. The air over Morgan Ranch seemed to thicken, no longer carrying the clean clarity of ordinary evenings. Clouds hid half the moon, scattering its pale light across the ground like smudged traces of old memories. Miriam stood at the sink, hands still smelling faintly of soap, but her mind was fixed on the front door where Caleb had just headed out with Hank to double-check the horse stalls. She'd heard of bandits drifting along the western frontier before, but the idea of them being this close tightened something deep inside her. She laid a hand against her chest, trying to steady herself. Her heart beat evenly, but stronger than usual. Lucy came out of the small bedroom hugging her cloth doll, eyes wide, a quiet worry swirling inside them. "Mom, where did Mr. Morgan go?" Miriam knelt down and pulled her close. "Has just checking the ranch. Sweetheart, everything's fine." Lucy nodded, But Miriam could see her daughter still clutching the doll as if letting go meant something precious might slip away. Thomas came in next, more anxious than Lucy, though he tried hard to hide it. His voice stayed steady, but his eyes betrayed him. "I heard Hank say there were bandits nearby. Is something happening?" Mom Miriam rested a hand on his shoulder. "Thomas, we're safe here. Don't worry. But tonight, I want you and Lucy to sleep in my room, just to make me feel better." Thomas didn't argue. He was only just learning what it meant to be grown. But losing his father had sharpened something in him, an instinct that told him there were times when questions only made things heavier. Outside on the porch, Caleb's boots sounded slow and heavy. He stepped into the kitchen, removed his hat, and his expression told Miriam everything. "How's the fencing?" she asked. "Secure. For tonight, at least. We locked all the stalls too, but no one should wander far from the main house after dark." Miriam heard the tension beneath his calm, not fear. Caleb Morgan feared nothing human. What she heard was responsibility, the weight of protecting everything within his boundaries. "Do you know anyone in that bandit group?" she asked quietly. Caleb didn't answer right away. He braced a hand on the table, eyes drifting toward the dark land beyond the window. "I'm not sure, but there's a chance I know their leader." A cold ripple ran along Miriam's spine, who Caleb drew in a deep breath, fighting a memory he'd buried long ago. "When I was young, Montana had a group of outlaws living off the grid. They raided homes, burned wagons, stole land. When the law closed in, they scattered. I crossed paths with one of them once. He held a grudge against me and against my father." He paused, his voice thinning, as though his past squeezed the breath from him. Miriam asked, softer still, "You think he's come back for you, maybe? Or maybe he's just passing through? But I don't believe in coincidences. If he's that close to the Southern Valley, it isn't by accident." Miriam studied him. Under the lantern glow, Caleb's face looked harsher than usual, like stone carved too long by storms. His temples tightened, a sign he was holding something in. She spoke gently. "Morgan, the past always finds a way to return when we think it's gone to sleep. But you're not the man you once were. You have Hank. You have this ranch." And she hesitated. "You're not fighting alone anymore." Caleb lifted his gaze to her. What she saw there wasn't the stoic patience she'd grown used to. It was something vulnerable and firm at the same time, gratitude mixed with warning, strength layered over fear. "I know, Miriam, but what scares me isn't what happens to me." He stopped himself, as if any further word might reveal too much. Miriam stepped a little closer, not so near as to cross a line, but close enough that their shadows on the wall intertwined like pieces that weren't fitting yet, but were beginning to lean into each other. "Then who are you worried about?" Caleb looked at her with a gaze that held nothing back, long, deep, and direct. "You and the children." For a moment, the kitchen stopped breathing. Miriam opened her mouth to speak, but a distant noise cut through the quiet, horses' hoofbeat echoing faintly across the fields. Both of them tensed. Caleb stepped onto the porch instantly. Eyes narrowed, but the sound faded. Maybe a wild horse, maybe nothing at all. Still, unease pressed its weight onto the house like a shadow settling in. Caleb stepped back inside. "You should put the children to bed. I'll keep watch tonight." Miriam shook her head. "You need sleep. I've lived through longer nights than this. Mrs. Dawson, don't worry about me." The way he spoke her last name carried a subtle shift distance he erected on purpose, a wall rebuilt because danger had drawn close. "He'll keep the light on in my room," Miriam said. "If something happens, I want to know right away." Caleb nodded. "He'll be watching." Night finally settled in. Miriam took Lucy and Thomas to bed. Once they fell asleep, she lingered beside them, her hand brushing gently over their hair. Memories of the months she spent running from her own past flickered through her mind, nights when she couldn't sleep, unsure what tomorrow would steal from her. She thought she'd exhausted her capacity for fear, but now fear returned, not for her own past, for the past of a man she was beginning to care about. She stepped onto the back porch. The light in the main house still burned. Caleb's silhouette moved behind the window, straight-backed, resolute, a sentinel of his own land. The wind tugged at his coat, lifting its edges. He didn't move. He was listening, attuned to every whisper in the night. Miriam wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold in the trembling warmth of worry. She knew she shouldn't feel this concerned, but hearts don't follow instruction. She whispered into the dark, "Hes protecting us, and I am afraid for him." It was a confession she wouldn't let anyone hear, but in admitting it, she realized something had changed. It was no longer just a job, no longer just gratitude. Something deeper was growing slowly, silently, but unquestionably. Then, suddenly, a noise from the distance, a soft scrape like stones shifting or heavy boots brushing through dry brush. Caleb lifted his head instantly, and in that moment, Miriam understood tonight would not be a peaceful night. The sound rose again from the southern edge of the ranch like stones knocking together, then rolling down into the grass. On any other night, it could have been wildlife wandering through the fields, but not tonight. Not after the stranger's warning. No one at Morgan Ranch could hear anything as normal anymore. Caleb stood under the porch roof, unmoving, eyes fixed on the darkness. Miriam lingered a few steps behind, her fingers tightening around the edge of her shawl. She didn't speak, but the soft rise and fall of her breath in the quiet night made Caleb turn. He glanced over his shoulder, just long enough to catch the worry etched plainly on her face. "Go inside," he said, his voice low, not harsh, but firm enough that Miriam understood exactly where his priorities lay. "It doesn't feel right to be inside if you're still out here. I have to be out here, and I need you to keep the children safe in the house." Miriam took in a long breath. "Mr. Morgan, you can't handle this alone." Caleb stepped closer than she expected. He lowered his voice to a level meant only for her. "Miriam, I can't focus if I know you're standing out here, in the open. Please, go inside." His words weren't an order, they were protection. Something in them softened her resistance, tugging at a place she didn't know was vulnerable. She nodded slowly, though her heart tightened like something unseen had taken hold. "All right, but be careful." Caleb dipped his head slightly. "I promise." Caleb Morgan's promises weren't casual things. They carried the weight of earth and timber, of everything that shaped the man he was. Miriam backed into the house, turning for one last look before closing the door. Caleb remained outside, alone with the dark tall and steady like an old ranch post that had weathered decades of storms. Inside. She left the lantern burning just as she'd said she would. She cracked the door to watch the yard. Every time the wind moved through the fence posts, it sounded like footsteps, and her pulse kicked harder. Lucy slept soundly. Thomas lay still, but his eyes were wide, fixed on the ceiling. "Is something happening?" "Mom," he asked. "It's just a noisy night. Sweetheart, try to sleep. You're worried." The small sentence struck straight at what she had been trying to hide. She moved closer and sat at the edge of his bed. "Thomas, do you trust me I do? Then trust me when I say we're going to be fine?" He nodded and closed his eyes, his breathing evening out. But Miriam knew he wasn't truly asleep, not a boy who had already lost more than a child should. She stood and turned back to the window. Outside, Caleb was still there. She watched him move, cautious and silent, tracking the faint sounds, Then he slipped out of sight behind the trees. The sudden emptiness in her line of vision made her chest constrict. She couldn't stand it anymore. She opened the back door quietly and slipped onto the porch, circling around toward the front. Each step was soft, but her heartbeat thundered loud inside her own ears. Near the fence line, Caleb emerged from the shadows of the trees. Miriam gasped softly, hand flying to her chest. "You scared the life out of me." He walked toward her, breath still heavy. His expression held a mixture of worry and quiet reprimand. "You shouldn't be out here. I just needed to make sure you were all right." Caleb stared at her, long enough that she had to shift her gaze, afraid he could hear the trembling in her chest. Then he spoke, voice low and steady. "There are fresh tracks, 3 men, recent—" A chill raced down Miriam's spine. "They're that close." He nodded once. "I think they're scouting. If it's the gang, I remember they always watch before they strike." Miriam rested her hand on the fence, eyes searching the ground like she could make sense of it. "You knew them. I keep feeling like this has something to do with you." Caleb looked away then, drawing in a breath, as though her words had scraped across something raw inside him. "I've never told anyone here." But he paused, gripping the fence rail until his knuckles whitened. "The man who leads them is Silas Granger. He used to work for my father. My father trusted him. I didn't, and I was right." His voice dropped, heavy as stone. "He was greedy, wanted the ranch when my father got sick. When my father threw him out, Silas swore he'd come back, but the law closed in on him first. He escaped. I thought he died or left the territory." Caleb turned to her then. "But if those tracks belong to him, he hasn't forgotten." Miriam stayed silent. Every word he said sank into her chest like iron. "How long have you lived with that fear?" she whispered. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence between them spoke for him. Then she said gently, "You're not alone anymore, Caleb." He looked at her, his eyes darkening, then lighting with something like recognition or disbelief that someone had dared to step into a place he kept locked away. "You don't understand. Then help me. I don't want you to fight by yourself." Caleb slowly raised a hand, not touching her, but stopping her words like a barrier. "Miriam, this is not the kind of danger you've known before. Silas doesn't just want property. He wants revenge, and he won't spare anyone around me." She shook her head. "I'm not afraid for myself. I'm afraid," her voice tightened, catching in her throat. "I'm afraid something will happen to you." Caleb froze. In the middle of the quiet night, so still it felt suffocating her words hit him harder than thunder. He opened his mouth to reply, but another sound cracked through the trees. This one was unmistakable. Heavy footsteps, a branch snapping under real weight. Caleb reacted faster than Miriam could blink, reaching for her, pulling her behind him, his body becoming a shield. "Get inside. Caleb, now." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone left no room for argument. Miriam ran toward the door, but her fear had shifted. It wasn't the strangers she feared anymore. It was the man standing alone in the darkness to protect everyone else. Caleb tightened his grip on his hat. His eyes hardened, not the patient, quiet gaze he wore in daylight, but sharp, blade-like, cold and controlled. A figure stepped out from the tree line, and just like that, the night stopped pretending to be peaceful. The figure walked out of the forest without haste, but each step was heavy enough to snap dry branches and make the space feel stretched. The dim moonlight behind the silver clouds shone on the tall, thin figure, as strong as steel wire. The long coat fluttered in the wind, dragging his shadow long on the ground. Miriam hid behind the door. Her heart clenched. She saw Caleb take a step forward, his shoulders tense, his back straight as an old wooden post that had weathered a western winter. The stranger stopped a few dozen paces away from Caleb. Caleb Morgan. His voice was as hoarse as crushed stone under wheels. Caleb didn't move. Silas, he laughed, a cold, short laugh, without a trace of warmth. Good. At least your memory is still good. Miriam felt a chill run down her spine at the name. It was him, Silas Granger, the shadow of the past that Caleb spoke of with a tension that could never be completely hidden. "I thought you were gone," Caleb said, his voice low and earthy. Silas spat, disappeared. "It took years to get back on track, but I knew this day would come. And you, Caleb Morgan, are still standing in the same place, holding this farm like it's the last remnant of your family." Caleb's lips curled slightly. "That's the only soul I need?" Silas laughed. The sound was sharp as a knife cutting through stone. "You still live in old Morgan's shadow, the faithful dog who keeps that rotten legacy. As for me, I'm back to get what I deserve." "You don't deserve anything here," Caleb replied, his voice as firm as a hammer on oak. Silas took another step forward. The moonlight revealed his face, thin, sharp, with icy eyes, and a scar that ran from his temple down to his mouth, making him look as if he were born to hate. "You think I forgot," he hissed. "You told the authorities. If it hadn't been for you, I would have taken what was mine when old Morgan was near death. I was so close to having it, but you ruined it." Caleb clenched his hat in his hand, his biceps bulging. Miriam saw he wasn't shaken, but his silence was like an animal holding its last breath before it charged. Silas tilted his head, smiling faintly. "I lost everything. Homeless, landless, living like an outcast. I swore I would return. I stand here today to keep that vow." Caleb didn't move. "Touch my men. I won't let you." Silas nodded slightly, his eyes glancing toward the main house. Miriam froze. He saw her. He knew she was there. Caleb immediately stepped aside, blocking his view. "You can't touch them." Silas raised his eyebrows, a wolfish smile on his lips. "Oh, so there's someone you want to protect, not just the hired hands." A tiny tremor appeared in Caleb's hand, not from fear, but from anger, so angry that the heat of it spread through the air. Silas laughed wickedly. "I knew it. Women, you always lose to women." Caleb's voice was low and cracked like earth cracking. "Don't touch them." And what if I wanted? Caleb set his hat on the ground. A wordless signal. Miriam had only seen him do that twice when preparing to pull a mad bull, and when preparing for real combat. Inside the house. Miriam held her breath, her hands clutching the front of her dress until they were numb. She wanted to rush out, but that would put Caleb in more danger. She wanted to scream, but feared even a loud breath would make things worse. Silas looked around the farm as if carving every corner into memory. Then he said, "I won't take anything tonight. I just want you to know I'm near. I want you to hear the same worry I feel every minute. I want you to know what it's like to be on the brink of losing everything." He faded into the shadows. "I'll be back. Caleb," his voice was like a poisonous wind through the pines, "and next time I won't be alone." Silas was gone. There was only the rustling of dry leaves. Caleb stood still for a long time. Miriam saw his back age years in just those few minutes. As he walked towards the house, Miriam opened the door before he could touch it. The two of them faced each other under the yellow light. No one spoke, but their breaths touched, in a distance that was not far enough to be far, but not close enough to be close. Miriam put her hand on his arm. "Mr. Morgan, are you okay?" Caleb looked at her. His eyes were so black the moon couldn't reach them. "I'm fine." Miriam shook her head, gently but firmly. "No, you're not okay." He was silent. 2 seconds, 5 seconds. Then he sighed a sigh that felt like a weight of the world had fallen off his shoulders. "He's back," Caleb said quietly, as if afraid the children would hear. "I thought I was free of the past, but I was wrong. Silas never let go." Miriam gently placed her hand on his. "You don't have to face it alone anymore." Caleb looked down at where their hands met. He didn't pull away, and neither did Miriam. The night wind blew through the crack in the door, carrying the smell of wet grass and a sense of uncertainty. For the first time, Caleb admitted what he had not dared to tell anyone for years. "I'm afraid I won't be able to protect everyone. I won't be able to protect you." Miriam's chest tightened. At that moment, she understood what he feared was not Silas. It was losing what he had just found. That night stretched longer than any Miriam had lived through on this land. After Silas disappeared into the dark, the air around the ranch felt tight, thin, like one deep breath might be enough to break it apart. She turned to Caleb, the man standing silent before her. His shadow fell long across the wooden floor, yet somehow his heart seemed heavier than even that. Caleb sank into the chair by the table, his hands still warm from the moment they touched hers. He lowered his head, shoulders drawn inward, as if he were finally allowing himself to feel the weight he'd been carrying. Miriam pulled her chair close enough to sense the faint tremble that only appears when the strongest man begins to question what waits for him ahead. Still staring at the table, Caleb spoke in a low voice. "I thought my past couldn't catch up to me anymore, but it was just waiting for the right moment to rise again." Miriam answered softly, "Every past finds its way back, but you're not standing alone this time. Caleb Morgan, you have to see that, not just hear it." Caleb looked up. His eyes were dark, deep, filled with emotions pressed down for far too long. "Miriam, am not afraid of Silas. Am afraid hell take what I value more than this land," Miriam whispered, almost like a breath of wind. "And what you're talking about is who." Caleb fell silent, a silence so weighted that Miriam felt her heartbeat stumble. Then, at last, he said, quiet but unmistakable, "You and the children." Miriam wasn't shocked. She'd felt this forming day by day, in every glance that seemed accidental, in every careful effort Caleb made to shield her without speaking it aloud. But hearing the words out loud, it stung her eyes with warmth. Caleb continued, "I don't want to lose anyone again. I've lost enough. And the thought of him returning, of him hurting you, I can hardly breathe." His hands clenched on the table. "I'm not a perfect man, and am not young anymore. But if I have to choose between running or standing my ground to protect the people I love, you'll stand. Even if it costs me everything." Miriam placed her hand over his, this time with intent, with strength. "Caleb, don't carry everything alone. No one asked you to do that. I spent a lifetime thinking I had to survive by myself, but when I met you, I realized silence can be its own kind of tenderness. Your silence was never indifference." Caleb held her gaze, and in his eyes she saw gratitude deep, Rwand, something gentler, more fragile, something he'd tried so long to hide but could no longer contain. Outside, the wind shifted. Branches tapped the roof like the night itself was reminding them dawn was near sunrise. Miriam helped Caleb lie down in the front room to rest. She draped a light blanket over his shoulders. Caleb opened his eyes the moment he felt her touch. "You're not sleeping?" he asked softly. "I will later. I want to make sure you're all right." Caleb tightened his hold around her wrist just briefly, just enough to say thank you without words. As he drifted into light sleep, Miriam stayed close. She studied the strong lines of his face, the face of a man who had lost too much, carried too much. She understood now, deep inside. Caleb didn't just need someone to love. He needed someone to trust. She wondered if she had enough courage to walk that path with him. When morning came, The sound of hooves echoed from across the field. Thomas and Lucy woke, rushing out before Miriam could hush them. But the sound belonged to two neighbors. Riding in, they had heard a stranger was seen near the ranch. Caleb rose, spoke to them, offered a few concise words that said enough. They promised to keep watch and help if needed. When they rode away, the ranch felt quiet again, but no longer alone. Miriam waited as Caleb walked back into the house. He stepped toward her steady, deliberate. "We need to talk," Caleb said. "I know," Miriam replied. "Silas isn't finished, and when he comes back, I'll be right there with you." Caleb held her gaze for a long moment, as if making sure she understood the weight of what she was offering. "No, Miriam, I want us to talk about something else." His voice grew deeper, but warmer than she'd ever heard it. "I've spent too many years keeping my heart locked behind silence. But you came with Thomas and Lucy, and suddenly that silence wasn't armor anymore. It became a burden. You reminded me that a house becomes a home only when there's someone to love inside it." Miriam felt her throat tighten. Caleb drew a long breath. "If you're willing, I want us to face whatever comes together. Too many years have passed in solitude. I want to know what it feels like to choose someone and be chosen back." He stopped there, waiting. Miriam opened her mouth, and for a heartbeat, no words came. She looked at Caleb, this man who stood like a mountain, yet whose heart had revealed a beautiful, unexpected fissure. "Caleb, I've lived a long life of loss and fear, but meeting you, it felt like meeting the version of myself I'd been searching for. Strong, but lonely. Proud, but wounded." She placed a hand over her chest. "I choose you. Not because I need someone to protect me, but because you make me believe in good things again." Caleb closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing something too big for words, and as sunlight brushed the edge of the porch, he stepped closer, taking both her hands in his. "Thank you, Miriam." Then he pulled her into his arms, not in haste, not in sudden passion, but as two souls who had survived too much, finally finding rest in each other, held against his chest. Miriam felt the world outside wild, dangerous, unpredictable, lost its power to frighten her. A lone bird called from the trees. Golden light spilled across the ranch. Miriam leaned into him, letting his warmth fill the spaces she thought would stay cold forever. A new day had begun. With a promise neither had to speak aloud, they would face whatever came next. Together, Silas or no Silas fear no longer stood between them. And sometimes silence is the most beautiful confession of love. As we grow older, we begin to understand that loss is something no one escapes. But it's how we rise after those losses that shapes the rest of our lives. This story reminds us of something simple, yet profoundly true, no matter how worn the human heart becomes with time. It still carries the ability to heal, so long as it is met with kindness, courage, and someone willing to believe in it. Love, in our later years, isn't the wild rush of youth. It is a choice, a deliberate opening of the heart, even when every weary part of us whispers it would be safer to stay closed. It is the courage to trust in a new peace, even while the past still lurks behind us demanding answers. And sometimes, silence itself, quiet, steady, unshaken, is the strongest form of healing we have. Thank you to those who have lived long enough to know that life is more than storms. It is also made of those gentle evenings that remind us the world is still worth staying in, still worth trying for one more time. If this story brought you even a little warmth, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps us continue bringing meaningful, human stories crafted for hearts that have weathered life just like yours.